Welcome, everyone, to the Child Psych Podcast. My name is Tammy, and I'm the co founder of the Institute of Child Psychology. I'm a mom of three. I'm a registered psychologist. And most important, I've got three kiddos at home who I adore. And so this work is so important to me. I just wanted to say welcome, Dayna, today to our podcast. We've been talking already. So I'm super excited to dive into some of the sensory stuff we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Lemon Lime Adventures. Like tell me a little bit about how you started and kind of your trajectory in your educational and professional journey here.
Yeah, so I started out as a teacher in inner city schools in Chicago. I was in the classroom for over 12 years. My favorite kiddos were the kids who came with a paper trail behind them, the ones that other teachers thought were too much, too difficult, too loud. The too much or not enough kids were my favorite kids. And so when I became a parent, I figured I got this thing down. I know exactly what I'm doing. Yeah, right. So I had my child and spent the first 7 years of raising him feeling like an absolute failure. I tried absolutely everything that I had been trained professionally to do, and then everything that went against what I believed in, but was willing to try anything. I was grasping at straws. And so by second grade, he was starting to be suspended more days than he was in school. So it was evident that the traditional school setting just wasn't working for him. And so I decided to homeschool him, quit my job, bring him home. And I had two goals. Number one goal was that he would not blame himself or hate himself for not fitting in. And number two is that he would not blame others for not understanding him. And that's really what we dug into, is trying to figure out how to help him understand himself and love himself, and also how to help me understand him and really see things from his point of view. And at that point, I had no idea what I was doing. And so I started searching homeschooling, and everything looked picture perfect. This was over 10 years ago, and everything looked picture perfect. And so I decided to start Lemon Lime Adventures as a blog to just share what I called the sweet and sour sides of life, and just really showcase what was going on, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. And it's what started as just my place because I felt so alone. I didn't want any other parent to feel that way. And I didn't want children to feel the way my child was feeling. And so that's what it started as. And lo and behold, I found out that there are not just a couple of us out there that feel alone, but there are millions of us that feel this way, who are dealing with challenges with our children in this way and made to feel like it's our fault. And so that kind of became my mission, is to help parents of even the most challenging kids to be able to create families that work together, advocate for each other, and empower each other through understanding and collaboration. So that's what I do now in a program called Calm the Chaos, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And we've lost our village. Like
Mm-hmm.
parents weren't meant, and that's such an important point, is we actually weren't designed to do this alone. And then parents wonder
Mm-hmm.
why they're struggling. And I'm like, well, yeah, from an evolutionary standpoint, we were supposed to have grandparents and great grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles that all support raising children.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at like these intact cultures, like traditional cultures that have the support systems. We don't see even the prevalence of these kinds of behaviors because there was always a village. And so I'm always like, my heart goes out to parents who
Mm-hmm.
feel so isolated. It's like, yeah, the struggle's real, and so many of us feel this way. I think we just need people like our organization, your organization, to normalize that. Yeah, like it is isolating, and every child's journey is different, and there's nothing wrong with you as a parent. Like every child has their unique gifts and talents and stories that we need to work through, and there's not one trajectory, is what I'm hearing you say about like the work you're hoping to
Absolutely.
promote.
Absolutely. I always say you are not failing and your child is not broken. And I think that that's something that is so important for every parent to realize, that your child is exactly who they're meant to be, and you're exactly the parent they need. And so it's about educating ourselves. It's about connecting with our kids, seeing our kids differently, so that we can create that relationship and that safe haven for our kids in a way that they can't find anywhere else. And through that, we will help them realize what are their own personal boundaries? What is their awareness of their self so that they can start to advocate for themselves?
Beautiful. Now, part of the reason I was so excited and I was doing all this, like reading some of your work last night actually and delving into this is because I do a lot of parent consults for kids who are struggling. And this came up actually this week in a or last week on a parent consult. And we were talking about sensory processing issues with some of the kiddos in our community. And this
Mhm.
has been, you have a book talking about sensory processing 101, I believe, is your book.
Mhm.
So I was hoping we could talk about that, and we can talk about it in terms of sensory processing disorder or just like kids who are highly sensitive, which is a temperament trait. Also, just, and then we'll talk about some strategies to support that. But you have some really interesting work on looking at we have the five senses, but there's
Mhm.
more than five senses. And I want to know, what are the other senses besides the five that we all know about? And what does that have to do with our kids and their behavior?
Okay. I'm just making some notes to make sure I hit all those points because you had some great points and some great things to talk about. So, when I first started with my son, none of us knew what sensory processing was, definitely didn't know what sensory processing disorder was. And I ended up having a child in my classroom, and the mom came to me and she's like, "My son has sensory processing disorder." Like, I've never heard of this. What are you talking about? And as I watched this kid, as I learned about this child, I was like, wait a second, this is a lot like my son who's struggling. I wonder if there's something here. And so that's where I actually started delving into this and realizing that there weren't just five senses, that there's actually way more. There's eight common senses that affect our day-to-day life, and that is every single person. So we'll talk about sensory processing disorder in just a minute, but what I want everyone to hear here is that this is not, just specialized for a certain type of child or a certain type of person. All of us have multiple senses, and it's not just about, oh, we can see and smell and touch, but it's how we integrate and how we interpret the world around us. And so you have your basic five senses, which is sight, smell. I always forget which ones I've said: sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing.
Hearing. Hearing, yeah.
Okay. So, and a lot of times we just think of those as fun little things that we need to teach our kids when they're in preschool and kindergarten. But even those basic five senses, we use those on a day to day basis. And so think about if you've ever been to a grocery store and you are just like, you know what, I am shopped out. I have got to leave. And you start to feel really itchy and overwhelmed. And maybe you're even getting a headache. Well, a lot of times that's because of your sight, your smell, possibly even your hearing. There might be a lot of different sensory input coming into your body that's just overwhelming you. So the bright lights and all the different smells and things coming in. The other thing that happens is think about, if I asked you, you know, what is your favorite clothing to wear? Some of you would be like, I love jeans and I love like a nice blazer, and then others might say, I need something soft all the time and I can't stand wearing socks to bed. Well, that's your tactile sense. And it's something that we forget that all of us have. So these other senses are just as prevalent. Matter of fact, I think that they play a huge role in how kids are behaving on a day-to-day basis, and they're getting misinterpreted as quote unquote bad behavior. And so the other three are vestibular. This is just quite simply your sense of movement. So this is just like your ability to move. And the way that I describe this to parents or to adults is you either love roller coasters or you hate them. You can get in a car and get car sick immediately if you read a book, or you could read a book the entire time you're in the car. That's your vestibular sense. That's your sense of movement. Then the other one that's really important is your proprioceptive sense. So, the easiest way for me to describe this is your body awareness. So, this is pressure, this is where your body is in space and time. And the easiest way for parents to understand this one is when you wake up in the middle of the night and you have to walk to the bathroom with it completely dark, can you get there without stubbing your toe? Do you feel like you need to lean on walls? Do you feel like you just are, you need to move and jump and have this pressure? Those are some of the things that our proprioceptive system is either asking for or is trying to avoid. And then the last one is missed so often, and this is your interoceptive sense. And this is your internal cues. So this is your ability to recognize if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're hot, if you're cold, and it's also your ability to sense your emotions. So if you think about that ability to regulate your internal cues and then think of what might happen if someone isn't as aware of those cues as other people, you're going to see some behaviors on the outside. So those are the main 8 senses. And I know
It's
we are going to cover a whole lot more, but I wanted to pause for a second just
yeah,
see
I
if you
think
had
it's
any
interesting.
questions.
Well, the biggest thing for me is, and we kind of talked about this before we went on air, is that really wanting parents to understand that the body comes first. Like we experience everything in our bodies first, then our emotions come second, then our thoughts.
Mhm.
So the brain develops from the bottom up. So the first question I always tell parents is the brain always asks is, am I safe? And we have to get a yes there if we're going to get good behavior, if we're going to get logical thinking, like all these things parents want. And one of the things I didn't know until I became a parent and started studying this and studying brainstem integration is what you're talking about, isn't we want to integrate the body with emotions and thinking and all of these things. Is if a child feels overwhelmed in these systems, whether that's taste or touch or the vestibular or the interoception, all these cues that go on, and they're overwhelmed, the body gets the brain gets a no, I don't feel safe. And then that child goes into fight, flight, freeze, collapse. They go into a stress response, which can be
Mhm.
yelling, kicking, screaming. They can't sit still. They get out of their chair. They run away. And really, it's not the child doesn't want to behave. That child's in a state of stress because their body feels not okay. They don't feel safe in their body.
Mhm.
And that's the first thing I ask parents to look at. And I think you do too. It's so neat to see the parallels in our work when we talk about emotion regulation. I was like, oh, we go to the body first. Like, first,
Mhm.
foremost, that's where we go. So I love that we, instead of jumping to like, oh, they're disobedient or they're, it's executive functioning, I'm like, maybe they just don't feel safe. Like their
Mhm.
bodies don't feel safe.
100%. And that's something that I've found over the years. The more that sensory processing is becoming more prevalent, it's really common to either A, discount it and say sensory processing is just for a disorder or for certain types of children, maybe a child with ADHD or an autistic child, a child who struggles with executive functioning. That's reserved for this special population. And I'll tell you, when I take flights, I can spot people who are struggling with their sensory preferences and struggling with their input, maybe because they're nervous, maybe because they're excited about where they're going, but you'll see people tapping, you'll see people biting their pens, people chewing their fingernails, and all of that is a sensory expression. And so you have this side where it's like, oh, it's just for this certain population. Nope, nope, it's not. It's all of us,
No.
all human beings. And then you have another population that, you know, and I was in this population, is that we feel like we have to become, experts in child development and all the different things and get a PhD in parenting to understand our kid, because we've tried all the things that are being suggested to us and it's just not working. And so when we learn about sensory, a lot of things start to kind of click. And the tendency or the trap that I see parents fall into is to explain everything away by sensory. And so what you're saying is absolutely right. I've developed this, we call it the behavior funnel, which helps parents systematically figure out what's under the behavior, starting with basic needs. And a lot of times people think, oh, hunger, tired, those sorts of basic needs that we all think about, but it's also their basic need of safety. We all have to feel safe first before anything else. Or just like you said, we go into that stress response. And so if we're looking at the funnel like a siphon and we check safety first, connection second, this feeling of
Mhm.
belonging and connection, which you talked about the village earlier. So if you don't feel like you belong somewhere or you don't fit in or you're not accepted as who you are, you're going to see all sorts of kinds of behaviors. I mean, look at our society today. Like we could really talk about that sense of belonging and how that lacking is causing a lot of outrageous behaviors. And then we can go to sensory. We can start looking at, okay, if we believe that they are safe, if we've checked all the boxes, they're not anxious or worried or nervous, then, and they feel like they belong, they're seen as who they are, then let's look at sensory and let's start digging into that. After we've checked those three boxes, now we can look at skills. Are they lacking communication skills? Are they lacking executive functioning? Are they lacking impulse control? What are the skills? And that's where we can look at emotional regulation and awareness. But we can't get there until we've done all these other checks to make sure that they're getting their needs met.
Yeah, my 3 questions I tell parents is like the 3 questions the brain asks is first, am I safe? That's sensory. It's also just like, is there any threats to my environment?
Mm-hmm.
Second, do I feel loved? Third is, do I feel competent? Like, do I have those skills? Do I have the ability to regulate? Do I have, the ability to plan ahead, to perspective take, to feel confident in my body, to feel confident in school? So to me, it's like, but we always start lower and then work our way up because that's actually how the brain forms. So this is what you're talking about is completely based in neuroscience, like brainstem,
100%.
limbic system, prefrontal cortex. Like that's the way the brain moves information in children. And that's the way we address children during challenging moments. So I
Mm-hmm.
love it. You're speaking my language here. Super
I
excited.
love it. I love it. Yeah. And it really can help, but I think a lot of parents don't get this information. And I love that the work you're doing, and there's others out there that are doing this work finally, but it's new. And as a parent, I know you know that, like it's new for the general public to have this information. So the more that we can get it out there, the better.
Beautiful. So let's bridge this conversation because what I'm hearing is we all struggle with sensory sensitivities. Like certain, like for me, smell is
Mm-hmm.
a big one. Oh my goodness. Like
Mm-hmm.
if there's a bad smell in my house or my house doesn't smell good, I'm very bothered by this. My
Mm-hmm.
son, for instance, hunger. Oh, good Lord. Like if he is hungry, it's a different human. Like I have a different child. Like I don't recognize him. It's just anyway. So I think we have issues with him with the interoception. He has a hard time reading hunger signals. So then it
Mm-hmm.
ends up in like misbehavior and dysregulation. He's just hungry. His glucose is too low. But it looks like misbehavior when it's really
Mm-hmm.
just, I think it's just a sensitivity to feeling depleted with his hunger. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but then we've got kind of a subset, which you address a little bit and we can just touch on. We don't have to spend too much time there. But we also have their sensitivities. Like some kids are highly sensitive in their just temperament. Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe Dr. Elaine Aron's work in the highly sensitive person, which I really encourage people to look into, which is a temperament trait, not a disorder. But then you have kids who are sensory processing disorder, which is a smaller subset. It's more than
Mm-hmm.
just a sensitivity. How would you define that?
So for me, I think it's two different things. I would put myself, if I was, putting myself in one of those categories, I would put myself in highly sensitive person in the fact that I am a deep feeling person. I am incredibly empathic. And that means that I feel and notice everybody else's emotions. And as an adult, I've now realized that I have to actually do an internal check and say, are those my emotions or are those someone else's emotions that are overwhelming me right now? And the more that I can do that, then the easier it is for me to navigate my day-to-day life. My daughter is very similar. She is a feeler and a noticer of all things. She also struggles with really intense sensory preferences, clothing, noise, things like that. So if we go somewhere, she wants headphones on. If we are picking clothes, they always have to be super, super soft, no
Mhm.
tags. Um, Now, so she's got really strong preferences. My son, on the other hand, it affected every part of his day from the minute he woke up to the minute he went to bed. And so just an example, growing up, I always chewed on my pens and chewed my nails. I knew nothing about sensory. That was obviously some bit of sensory and anxiety wrapped up in one. But my son chews his bedpost. My son chewed his brother's toenails off at a young age. Like my son touches everything without thinking about if it's dangerous or not. Like he is just constantly seeking out this sensory input because he doesn't recognize that input, and his body is not aware of it. He's, it's underdeveloped and he's needing that input. Another thing is that he can be really overstimulated by sensory, and it can just go from 0 to 1,000 and cause huge disruptions in his day to day. Now, the more that we've learned about his sensory needs and what works for him and what doesn't work for him, we've been able to create an environment where he can thrive. But just out of the gate, without anyone knowing how to support him or anyone knowing what was going on under the surface, it's 100% categorized as a disorder because he didn't have the tools, he didn't have the ability to regulate those sensory needs, and it was affecting every single part of his day. And so that's where I kind of draw the line. As I'm going to go ahead and say, I am not an OT, I am not a doctor, I am a parent and I'm an educator. And so where I draw the line is where it's affecting a large part of your child's day in and out. And no matter what supports you're putting in place, you're finding that really difficult to help your child regulate their sensory needs. And that's when you reach out and you go to a therapist, you go to an occupational therapist,
Yeah.
and you say, can you do a, sensory profile on my child? Can you see what you notice and see if I'm on the right track here, or is it something else? Is it possibly anxiety? Is it possibly a feeling of not feeling safe? Is it a lack of connection? Is it a lack of impulse control? Can you help me kind of identify where this is coming from?
Right. And what I was doing when I was looking up some reading on this last night, my understanding, because there's, people who are sensory sensitive, like your highly
Mm-hmm.
sensitive children and adults. Again, Dr. Elaine Aron's work on this is amazing. And then when you've got sensory processing disorder, my understanding is you have oversensitivity and some kids are undersensitive. And the
Mm-hmm.
signals aren't being detected appropriately in their brain. And the brain is not interpreting the sensory information correctly. So, of course, kids like either don't feel it very well or they overfeel it. And it becomes, and
Mm-hmm.
they might experience it as very extreme or not at all. And they end up getting burned or hurt, like because the brain is just not communicating this information in appropriate ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, that's where I always send people is to an OT. Like they come to me as a psychologist and I said, well, this child might just be highly sensitive, but we're going to rule out the disorder by going to an occupational therapist because
Mm-hmm.
that's where. So if any of you are
And,
worried,
and
that's the person you go to.
I hope this is okay to say, and this might be kind of controversial, is that
Yeah, go for it.
I actually I think the more that we can move away from, is it a diagnosis? Is it not a diagnosis? Is it this? Is it that? Is it this or is it that? I think diagnosis has a place. I think it's a tool in a toolbox and it can help you find supports and it can help you understand yourself and your child. But I think if we look more holistically at who is this child I have in front of me? Who am I holistically? What works for them? What doesn't work for them? How do we create an environment of safety and understanding and compassion for these children and acceptance for children who operate in the world different than we do? I think that discussion is even more important than whether it is a disorder or not, but I might be in the minority there.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. And I mean, one of the things that Tanya and I talk about in our work is we rarely actually use disorders, usually
Mhm.
just because of the DSM and how unreliable we really think it is in terms
Yes.
of help and if that label helps. The nice thing is if you go see an OT, they will be able to usually give you some exercises to help your child integrate those sensory pieces, which is a
Mhm.
perfect caveat here is if we've got parents here who are listening and are like, oh my gosh, that's my child. They struggle so much with, certain textures or scents or sounds.
Mhm.
We obviously want to tell people look at your book. You have a ton your blog, you have a wealth of information. What are some like where could they start maybe? What are some of your favorite activities with sensory processing issues that parents
Yeah,
could like just
so
try today?
one of my, when in doubt, I always suggest using some sort of proprioceptive input. But I'm gonna again give a small caveat before I start this. Sensory activities and sensory supports are all unique to your child because what might work for one child might not work for another. And the reason for this is because of what you just said, Tammy, about some children being over responsive and some children being under responsive. So you might give one child a swing, a break on a swing, and it might activate them or excite them. Whereas you might put another child in a swing and it just cools them down and relaxes them. And so anything I'm going to share right now, I want you to make sure that you go into experimentation with your child instead of just handing these activities down on high and saying, let's do this thing and expecting it to work and then throwing it out, everything, baby with the bathwater type of thing, and saying, well, sensory doesn't work. And because it's all about identifying what's going to work for your child. But with that being said, I I believe that proprioceptive activities are, when I'm in doubt, that's the stuff I go to. So this is body squeezes. This is any sort of activity where you're putting pressure on the joints. And so that might be wheelbarrow walks. That might be walking like an animal. That might be really big hugs. For my son, I would brace my feet on the floor, put my two hands out, and then he would push against me. And this would help him get that sensory input he desired without having the hitting, the kicking, the breaking of things. And then you can also do deep pressure massage just right on the joints. And so one of the things that I do for my daughter is we'll start right at her fingertips and we just wiggle her tip of her finger and then go through each of her joints and just kind of pull and wiggle really lightly. We go all the way up. Plus it adds some connection, but you're giving them that proprioceptive and tactile sensory input. It is a lot of times really helpful for children. It's not an activity, but some tools that I find really helpful is having on hand something that can help with the sound. We don't go anywhere without our new noise reduction earmuffs or ear plugs. And then we also make sure that we have sunglasses on hand anytime we go outside. We keep gum on hand and fidgets. And these are all things that we've found that really help our children get their sensory needs met without it turning into an outward behavior. So hopefully that is helpful. It's less activities and it's more supports and ways to help our children thrive in the environment. I do have one more too, if
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
And that is visuals. So we forget so often, we tell our kids things, we give them instructions, but the more that we can break things down into a visual, like schedule or break things down with pictures or with doodles or with charts, it is so much easier for our kids to process and get things done and understand what's needed when they can see it in a visual format. And that's actually a sensory tool.
Beautiful. Yeah, my favorites, because I have a child, my middle, who is highly sensitive. So, not sensory processing disorders, just highly sensitive. And for her, for just a coping mechanism, so I don't know if these are activities so much as coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
When she comes home from school, weighted blanket is like the best thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
My son sleeps with a weighted blanket. It works. I don't know why it works, but it works. Headphones, like you were mentioning, headphones at school, not when teacher is teaching, but when the class is noisy. She's very sensitive to sound. So putting
Mm-hmm.
on those headphones with, and of course you collaborate with the teacher is one of them, and giving space for the fact that meal times, she is highly sensitive to texture. And it is
Mm-hmm.
not her being ornery or stubborn that some food literally makes her want to vomit. Like she gets
Mm-hmm.
ill, certain textures in her mouth. And so we have just learned different cooking strategies. So we're still getting those particular vegetables or something in for her, but maybe they're just cooked, they're more raw form versus cooked form. And
Mm-hmm.
most people, well, not most, but I think a lot of parents will assume your child's being obstinate or being oppositional. And once we understood it was a sensory thing, it's a complete
Mm-hmm.
reframe in like meal times for us. It's a complete reframe for
100%.
bedtimes and like her not paying attention in school. It's like, She
Mhm.
can't because of all the noise. So just
All the
adding
input,
those
all the
headphones.
noise, think of all the things when I was a teacher in the classroom, you would get graded as a teacher on your charts that you had up on the wall. And I would try to keep mine as minimal and as clear as possible because I knew that that was overwhelming for so many children. If you think of the primary classroom, many of the primary classrooms are rainbows and bright colors. And again, that can be really overwhelming for a child who is sensitive to sensory input, whether it's a disorder or not. So again, it comes back to being aware that this is something that we all experience, and that when our senses are overwhelmed or underwhelmed, we're going to see some differences in behavior. And so the more we can understand where it's coming from and create an environment that supports our children, the more successful we're going to be and the better relationships we're going to have with our kids.
Awesome. Well, you've got so your first book you wrote, I'm not sure if it's co-authored, but the Sensory Processing 101. Am I correct?
Mhm.
In
Yeah,
okay,
so
so that
Sensory Processing 101 was co-authored with an occupational therapist and a physical therapist, and they shared from their perspective, and I share from the teacher-parent perspective.
beautiful. So that might be a source, but you also have a book coming out in
Yes.
August, right? And
Mhm.
it's called Calm the Chaos, which is
It
going to talk a
is.
little bit about sensory, but what else is that going to speak to?
Yeah, and I know we weren't planning on talking about this, but I hope it's okay. We've talked so much about
Yeah.
sensory activities that I do want to share my second book, Super Kids Activity Guide to Conquering Every Day, is actually written to children. And it's written and it breaks up its activities. The whole book is just activities that help children navigate the challenges of a day. And a lot of them are sensory activities. And so I just wanted to share that one because it is a
Yeah.
great resource for looking for activities you can do with your kids and tools you can create. Like we actually have a do-it-yourself handmade weighted blanket in that book, and other things like that, like a wiggle seat and handmade fidgets and things like that. And so kids seem to really, really love
Oh.
that book.
Oh, yeah, my kids would be all over that. And I was a teacher too, actually. I was an elementary teacher before I became a psychologist. And I saw, a lot of the OTs would come into my room and the behavior aides would be armed with these things. They'd be armed with
Mhm.
weighted blankets and vests and fidgets and certain things and wiggle seats, and they were a lifesaver. But if you can
Yes.
get kids really involved in the creation, like owning this and that competence piece, and that to me is brilliant. So now I'm going to look at
Yes.
this book. That's
Yes.
interesting. And then Calm the Chaos is written more, that's kind of an overarching kind of book you have coming out
Yeah.
in August. It gets
Well,
kind of
it's more
talk.
of a book for parents, and it is a step-by-step roadmap that takes you from, we call them storms, so surviving your worst days to thriving as a family team together, where everyone's working together. And a lot of times we talked about this. We jump to the skills, we jump to the strategies, we jump to what I kind of consider best case scenario. Your family is working beautifully and this is how you communicate. But when you're in the throes and the thick of it and you're in the trenches, you need something so simple that you can remember when your kid is, punching you or running away from you or jumping on things, or, you're dealing with those really big quote unquote storms. And so this book walks you through, we have a simple framework. It's 4 simple steps, and it walks you through 5 stages that every parent goes through from surviving the storm to thriving as a family. And every stage has a plan that's just those 4 steps. And so by
Oh,
the end of each stage, you will have a plan that you can use immediately.
beautiful. Remind me, we need to have a podcast for you with you this August when
Okay.
your book comes out so we can talk
I
about
would love
that,
that.
because I please send me your book so we can look at
I
that and do
will.
like
I
a
will
podcast on
definitely.
that. Always looking for new resources and to promote. We want to promote people's work. That's what we do. Um,
Thank you.
so, and then people also can go to your blog. It's is it lemonlimeadventures.com or is lemon,
It
sorry, I was trying
is.
to,
It is. We're
okay.
currently, it's like we're in that messy middle of, we were Lemon Lime Adventures for almost 10 years. And the more and more work that we're doing in the world, it really is. If you go to our social channels or anything like that, it's Calm the Chaos Parenting. And so we're doing this
Okay.
like flip over. So right now the blog is lemonlimeadventures.com, and every other resource, like if you're looking for the book, it's calmthechaosbook.com. And then all our social channels are Calm the Chaos Parenting.
Okay, perfect. That's where parents can find you. That's beautiful.
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you so much. I feel like we could have talked about this. I have so much more to add about sensory input and the brainstem and like safety for kids. But I mean, that's why we introduce people to your work, because I'm sure this is what you're talking about, is for parents to be curious about their children's behavior. To,
Mhm,
Dan Siegel would say, chase the why. Like instead of just
mhm.
judging and reacting, it's just saying like, pausing and being curious as to what might be going on for my child. And
100%.
yeah, so I really appreciate that we're taking a deeper delve into who our children are, and I
Mhm.
really appreciate you even checking me today about the disorder. I think that's in our field, that's something we are trained to go down that road, and keeping me honest, being like, you know what, that is not always like the way to go. Like parents, and they can't often access those supports. So I'm grateful for people like you who give us a reframe, and then you actually provide wonderful books and websites where parents can get the help they need, and they don't necessarily need to see an OT. They can do this work at home, which is practical, and
And I
we
think
love that.
professionals are amazing. So please don't hear that I was discounting professionals or even a diagnosis, because those can open doors to resources and supports that you would never have any other way. I just think that there's a lot of weight being put on whether it's a disorder or not, because the children that are never going to get a disorder diagnosis, my daughter is probably never going to get a diagnosis. However, she still needs supports for her feelings of safety, for her connection, for her big emotions, and for her sensory needs.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. It was a lovely interview, and I'm so excited to read your book in August. And hopefully, we'll get to connect again in the summer to talk
Yeah.
about your book, which I think is a whole nother thing from what I'm hearing. I want to explore that and your roadmap a little bit. So, thank you so much, Dana, for your time today.
Well, thank you so much. This is absolutely an honor.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop.